Hello and welcome once again to the Justin Center podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper. Thank you so much for joining me once again on the program today. I do just want to give everyone a reminder, as always, that Just and Sinner as an organization is supported by donors. So we do ask that if you have benefited from the things that we do as an organization, the theological educational materials that we produce, that you consider becoming a contributor. You can go to justandsinner.org, go to our donate page and help us out there. There are multiple ways that you can support us. Well, we are going to be jumping in today to a discussion about John Duns Scotus. Now, when I was initially making my Makers of the Modern World video series, I was really not planning on going back all the way to the medieval period to explore the development of modernity. However, I've thought a little bit more about this as I have just gotten a lot of questions, specifically about the rise of medieval nominalism and Scotus, and how medieval nominalism kind of sets the stage for the rise of modernity. In particular, I have been thinking about doing a rather extensive, in-depth response to the common claims that the teachings of the Reformation are essentially adoptions of nominalist views of reality in one way or another. I think that thesis is deeply flawed for a number of reasons. And as I began to prepare for really a talk covering that issue, I realized that it would be worthwhile to start talking about some of these late medieval nominalist thinkers and their entire systems as a whole before jumping into that. So take this as a kind of precursor to the development of modern philosophy with René Descartes. We're kind of leading up to that in intellectual history. And so we're going to start here with a thinker, as I'm talking about nominalism, who really isn't a nominalist. However, he is a figure who is very important for the development of nominalism and creates many of the categories that are adopted by nominalists, and that is John Duns Scotus. And so sometimes John Duns Scotus is considered the first modern thinker, and so that's the subtitle of this talk, John Duns Scotus, the first modern thinker. Okay, so what's the importance of Scotus before we delve into looking at his ideas and his life, though we don't know much about his life? Hans Urs von Balthasar, who's a very influential Roman Catholic theologian and thinker in the 20th century, contends that Duns Scotus is to be considered really the first truly modern thinker. And in Balthasar's estimation, Scotus, particularly his concept of univocity, and we'll talk about what that means, this is the seed from which secularism grows and the world becomes secularized, demystified. Religion or the church are divorced from the regular happenings of the world, which happens during the Enlightenment and modernity. So that's kind of the thesis, and Balthasar has really popularized this view of Scotus, as well as this connection between Scotus and the Protestant Reformation. So in some popular treatments of intellectual history, Scotus is viewed at times as the pivotal figure in the decline of the prior medieval worldview, or one might even say the medieval consensus. And this often is accompanied by claims that Scotus impacted Protestantism rather than Roman Catholicism. And this moved the world away through the adoption of some of Scotus and later Occam's categories by Protestants away from the kind of scholastic realism that defined the earlier medieval world, taken from the ancient Greek thinkers, as well as adopted into the system of Christian theology, particularly Western Christian theology we're talking about here. Now, I'm going to challenge that. I want to seriously challenge this idea that Scotus had this broad impact just on the Protestant world and didn't do so on the Roman world. I think it's a very simplified view of history, both of what's going on among the Protestants and what's going on in the Counter-Reformation. And what you're going to find if you look through the post-Reformation era is that there is a very strong Scotist school that remains highly influential after the Reformation as well, even holding on to many of those ideas that are the ones that are often blamed for whatever ills the modern world might face today. So as we talk about the rise of Scotian philosophy and then nominalism after that, we have to talk about some things that are going on during this time period at the end of the 13th century. Now, during the 13th century, Aristotelian philosophy has gained a foothold in the academy throughout Europe. And this begins with the rediscovery of Aristotle among some Islamic philosophers, which was then brought into Europe. And St. Thomas Aquinas is going to be the most significant figure who incorporates Aristotle's philosophy within his theological system. Other people do it. It's not just Thomas, but Thomas does it the most comprehensively. And today, when you think about the most influential or important Roman Catholic theologians, Thomas Aquinas comes to the forefront of your mind, probably, if you know anything about Roman Catholic theology or philosophy. He really has a hold far more than anyone else on contemporary Roman Catholic thinking. But one might be surprised to see that the initial responses to St. Thomas Aquinas were not entirely positive. And there is a perspective that is highly critical of Thomas in the 13th century, but this is ongoing through the 17th and even into the 18th century. Eventually you have this kind of neo-scholastic revival where Thomas Aquinas becomes the official philosopher and theologian of the Roman Church, who we call the angelic doctor. Okay, well, in the 13th century there are a lot of concerns. There are a lot of concerns about the teachings of Aristotle and how widely Aristotle has now been used. His influence spread so significantly in the 13th century that by the end of that century, he was just thoroughly integrated to the entire academic curriculum in Paris. Not only in Paris, but we're talking here first about Paris. That is largely through St. Thomas Aquinas. He did it the most comprehensively, though, again, it's not only St. Thomas Aquinas that does this either. Now, there is concern about Aristotle's philosophy and areas where Aristotle's philosophy is inconsistent with Christian theology. Now, nobody really doubts that there are elements of Aristotle's system that aren't Christian or that are in conflict with Christian truth. But here there are specific concerns that some of Aristotle's ideas are being incorporated into Christianity where there really is no cohesion between the two systems. So in 1270, Etienne Tempier, who is the Bishop of Paris, condemns Aristotle, and he has 13 specific propositions about Aristotle's ideas that he condemns are in opposition to Christianity. And he is in communication with the Pope as he does this as well, and then he makes a further and more comprehensive condemnation in 1277. Now, this condemnation was written up 3 years to the day after St. Thomas Aquinas' death. And so Thomas isn't really seeing at least this strong opposition in his own lifetime. It's really right after, though 1270, of course, Thomas is still alive at this point. But the strongest opposition to Thomas's system comes after Thomas's death. And this particular document contains 219 condemned propositions. Some of these are taken directly from St. Thomas Aquinas, though others are taken from Avicenna or Aristotle or some others that are influential as well. Okay, this is not happening only in Paris, however, but the Archbishop of Canterbury at this time, Robert Kilwardby, repeated these condemnations to the church in England. And then following Kilwardby, John Peckham, he's the next Archbishop of Canterbury, condemns Thomas's views even using the language of heresy. He calls Thomas Aquinas' system heretical. So this all has a significant impact on what happens in the 13th century and in the 14th century. Now that there is a lot of skepticism about the usefulness of Aristotle, the church authorities are trying to crack down, at least some of them are cracking down on the prevalence of Aristotle within the academy. Now, these condemnations that we have here, they don't eliminate scholastic thought. There's no, papal bull that deals with this in some comprehensive way or something like that. But they do help to impact and support what is a growing distrust of human reason. And it also begins to form and increasingly grow a chasm between the disciplines of theology on the one hand and philosophy on the other. Now, the Franciscans in particular were increasingly skeptical of philosophy. Oftentimes, they began subsuming the entire discipline of philosophy underneath theology, leading to a kind of fideism, at least at times. And during this period of reaction against Thomas, the 14th century, there is this kind of increasing divide that happens between these two elements of medieval spirituality, mysticism and scholasticism, or what we might say is the heart and the head. And it's sometimes been said that after the 13th century, in the medieval period at least, we don't have scholastics that are also saints. And so the argument is what happens is there is this increased divide between the life of the mind and the rest of the fulfilled life, or the practical life of the Christian. And so scholasticism becomes kind of purely intellectual, and then those who are more oriented toward the practical life kind of flee from scholastic thought altogether. Bonaventure is going to be a really significant figure here. He is often set forth as the strongest antithesis to the scholasticism of the Thomists, and he becomes an opponent of William of Ockham, who was a thinker who's greatly influenced by Scotus, who was more explicitly a nominalist than Scotus himself was. Okay, so I've thrown out this word nominalism a bunch of times. So what exactly is nominalism? Well, it is a movement within late medieval scholasticism that moves away from the Aristotelian consensus, moves away from the use of Aristotle, the heavy use of Aristotle in theology. And this is dominant in the 14th and the 15th into the 16th century. And so it is largely nominalist philosophy that is being taught and promoted during the time period of the Reformation. This is why, Martin Luther, his training was largely among the nominalists. And when someone like Martin Luther is referring to the scholastics, he mostly is referencing the nominalists because they were the scholastics of this time. There's always a Thomist school that remains, but the Thomistic school is not dominant at that point in the way that one might expect, in the way that it is today. So some of the proponents, there are a lot more than these. These are just a few kind of the major names that you're really going to need to know. Peter Abelard is the earliest of these names. He's not actually the first nominalist, but he's the first well-known nominalist within the scholastic tradition. And Abelard is a bit of a controversialist in a lot of ways. And there's a debate between Abelard and Bernard of Clairvaux. But his years are 1079 to 1142. Then you get William of Ockham, and he is next figure you really have to talk about along with Scotus, or after Scotus here. His years are 1287 to 1347. Then Gabriel Biel, and Gabriel Biel stands as the most important of the nominalists during the era of the Reformation in the 16th century. So his years are 1420 to 1495. And if you look, for example, at Martin Luther's critiques of scholastic theology, he is largely critiquing the ideas of Gabriel Biel, particularly the way that he conceives of grace and the human will. And then we have Duns Scotus. And Duns Scotus, his years are 1266 to 1308. And he's an influence on nominalism. He's very important for the development of nominalism, and for the directions that nominalism goes, and for the move away from that Thomistic consensus. But he's not quite himself a nominalist. So what are the primary ideas of nominalism? Well, I'm going to go through these very quickly. I have a lot of videos that I've done explaining this in a lot more depth. So if you want to get some of this in more depth, I'd recommend looking through my channel and just looking up nominalism. I'll try to remember to post a video below, but I probably will forget, but I'll try to remember. And I know if I don't remember, somebody will comment on it, and then I'll fix it. So, okay. But the first point is a denial of universals. And when we're talking about universals, we're talking about ideas, universal concepts or terms that we use to refer to things or ideas in the world. For example, we talk about, you may take something like justice. And so the one who believes in universals is going to say that justice is something real. The idea of justice is not merely a human concept. It's not merely a way a word to use to categorize certain things, but there is a real essence. There is a reality to this concept of justice. It really exists. And the nominalists are going to move toward a view that says that, well, essences or ideas really only have shared names or nomina, not some reality that is shared between them. So we use this, for example, word justice to just describe or name certain actions or things which have something in common. But justice isn't really a thing by itself. There's also a view called conceptualism, which is just another form of nominalism, which says that something like justice may be real, but it's real just in the human intellect. We have a shared understanding of justice in our minds, but that doesn't mean that justice is something that really exists outside of the mind. It's just a shared, concept. And so this view is going to say that reality is not found in the universal ideas, universal categories, universal genus or species, but instead reality is found only really in the particular things, the individual things. It's part of an ongoing debate since the very beginning of philosophy about the relationship between universality and particularity. Okay, so the second aspect of nominalism is what we call voluntarism. And voluntarism, voluntas means will. We're talking about the primacy of the divine will, God's will, as determining justice and moral law. This we'll talk about more in this talk, so I'll explain it then. There's a stronger separation between the fields of theology and philosophy that happens among the nominalists. And the final point here is there's a move toward empiricism. Empiricism means deriving knowledge through sense experience rather than through contemplation of universal truths. So there's a focus more on experience. And anytime you get a system that is going to focus more on particulars rather than universals, you're generally going to move toward an empiricist view of epistemology, meaning how you get knowledge, because human reason abstracts, right? Human reason tries to come up with universal principles about the way things are, but empiricism, our senses, deal with specific experiences, specific things that we encounter, specific conversations that we have. And so there's a move toward this empirical knowledge, or knowledge that derives from our sense experience here. Okay, so let's talk then about Scotus as much as we can talk about him. We don't know very much about his life at all. We know him almost entirely from his works. We have some later stories about Scotus that we don't even know are true, so I'm not even including these here at all. So Scotus, 1266, 1308 to 1308. He is from Duns, which is where the name comes from here. It's in southern Scotland. He was ordained in 1291 in Northampton. It's actually from the year of his ordination that we go back and figure out the year he was probably born, because he was probably 25, which was standard at his ordination. He taught at Oxford beginning at some point in the 1290s, don't know the exact date. He lectured in Paris for a time from 1302 to 1303. He was expelled from Paris for siding with the Pope over the French monarch Philip IV over an issue of taxation, and he died in Cologne in 1308. Not much information, but that's kind of what we got. So we don't know that much about his life. As influential of a figure as he is, we really know him only from his ideas, not really from his life at all. So what are his major works? Well, his major works first are these lectures on the sentences of Peter Lombard. Now, the sentences is the standard dogmatics or theological textbook during this time period. Everybody lectures on Lombard sentences. And many of these lectures on the sentences that you're going to find really are more than just commentaries on Peter Lombard's work, but they use Lombard's work as a way to talk about whatever they want to talk about. Not that it's not relevant to Lombard's work, but it's kind of a jumping off point to talk about all sorts of other things, just as you'll find on the commentaries on Aristotle as well. And these kinds of things include the Reformation era too. This continues at that time. So in his lectures on Lombard, he delves into really all of the major areas of his entire philosophical theological system. So he has lectures that he delivered in Oxford, and his other lectures that he delivered at Paris. There are multiple editions of the lectures he delivered at Oxford, because some are things that he wrote, some are what his students wrote. And so these are published as the Ordinatio, at least one edition of them is. The lectures in Paris are published as Reportatio Parisiensis. And so these, again, this is the major works, the major ideas of of Scotus show up here in these talks on Lombard. Then he has a few different commentaries on Aristotle. I didn't specify them here. There's some short disputations from 1300 to 1305-ish, which are published as collationes. He has a book on natural theology, De Primo Principio. He has a public disputation that covered a number of different issues. This is a kind of disputation where you'd have people bring all sorts of challenges and questions. Questiones quod libetales. So many of these are translated into English. You can get some good summary volumes of Scotus. I don't think there actually is, as far as I know, a critical edition of Scotus's works available in English, at least not yet, at least as last I looked. So when I had delve more deeply into Scotus's writings. But there are a number of volumes that you can get which compile the kind of relevant philosophical sections. And honestly, you're probably going to get a better or easier overview of Scotus in reading one of those volumes than you will just reading through the sentences and his commentaries on the sentences and then kind of going after the little pieces of his thought that show up at disparate places. Okay, so one of the things that you find in Scotus, and I said this is one of the characteristics of nominalist philosophy, or really scholastic philosophy altogether, at the end of the 13th century on, is that there is a increasingly stronger distinction or division that you get between theology and philosophy as disciplines. And so at the time of St. Thomas, they're very much integrated. Now, this doesn't mean that there is no distinction at all between the two disciplines, as it is recognized that they're not precisely identical, but it's not always easy to parse out what's theology and what is philosophy. Now, these debates certainly don't end with Scotus. These are things that people are continuing to debate into the 16th and 17th century as well. Really, these debates still go on today, but there's an extensive amount of debate about this, especially in the 17th century. And that's among all Christians of various stripes are all debating these things. And Scotus has a say still among people in those debates. One of the ways that Scotus is going to distinguish between theology and philosophy is he's going to say that they have different subjects. So he's going to say that for theology, God is the subject, and for philosophy, being is the subject. And really, there's the prioritization of metaphysics, which is something that is more central during this period of time than it is later. And actually, the nominalists move away from considerations of being following this, really more centering on things like logic than the nature of being itself. Scotus also moves away from the perception that theology is considered a science. Another ongoing debate in theology is how do we determine theology? What is it? Is it a science or is it something else? And he's going to say that it is not a science in the way that philosophy is. Instead, theology always has a practical end. And so the end of theology is practical in a way that philosophical disciplines are not. And the sciences have different methods and modes of attaining knowledge than theology does. So the sciences as a whole are known largely through deductive reasoning. Specifically, we're talking about philosophy here. And theology is not known by means of deductive reasoning. We're not just theologizing by means of abstracting universal principles and making logical conclusions from a syllogism, any kind of logical form. Instead, theology comes through revelation, what God has told us about himself. And we could talk about forms of revelation because there are different forms of revelation in different theologies. Scotus is really going to shift how natural revelation is to be understood or what can be known through natural revelation. So classically, we have this distinction in Christian theology between natural and supernatural revelation. Natural revelation is that which can be known through nature without Scripture or the Church. Supernatural revelation is that which is derived through Scripture. And for the Roman Catholic, it's also the Church is going to be included in that as well. So the means that God has chosen to specifically reveal things about himself that are not known by means of nature. Okay, Scotus is also going to distinguish the two in that he is going to say that philosophy deals with necessary being, with necessary laws, the way things must be, whereas theology is based on contingent things, contingent events. Things like the atonement, the cross of Christ. This is not necessary in an absolute sense. It is a contingent thing, and it's contingent upon the reality of human sin and upon God's will, as we'll talk about with voluntarism. So Scotus is going to say, though, that natural reason is not useless. It can arrive at knowledge of God's existence, and he has an argument for the existence of God. It becomes quite confusing, but he does have one, and he finds it compelling. And he also believes that one can arrive at a certain knowledge of God's attributes just through natural reason. So in this way, he doesn't differ from St. Thomas Aquinas in that both of them are going to say that there's a difference between what's known through natural revelation and then supernatural revelation. And through natural reason, one can come to the conclusion that God exists, and one can arrive at some of the divine attributes. And I think that this is kind of necessitated from a scriptural perspective, because this is the way that Paul seems to argue, the Apostle Paul seems to argue in Romans chapter 1. All right, so now we get to one of the most controversial elements of Scotus's system. And this element of his system is the one that Balthasar mentions, that I talked about earlier, as really being at fault for many of the ills of the modern world. And it is often taken to be the case that univocity of being is kind of domino that begins to knock down a bunch of other dominoes, and eventually it leads to pure chaos societally and morally and everything else. So we have to talk then about univocity of being and say, is that really a fair characterization of this or not? Okay, well, let's talk then about, quickly, before I jump into the points of my slide, what univocity is in relation to other ways of understanding how it is that we speak about God. There are different ways that theologians talk about the nature of God and how God relates to the human concepts that we have of God. And so we have a number of things that we attribute to God. We talk about his love or his power or his justice. Let's just take his justice as our example here. And so the question is, well, what do we mean? What does it mean when a human being who has a very human concept of justice, we know justice from our own experience, which is a very limited experience and a very imperfect experience. When we say that God is just, what do we mean by that? Is that term precisely identifying something that is true about God? In other words, when we say God is just, does that mean the same thing as when we say that something in this world is just? Or are we using a concept that has a different meaning when applied to divine things, eternal things, and earthly things? And so there are different ways of expressing this. Now, Thomas Aquinas has this view called the way of analogy. And what he says is that what's called analogical predication. You'll hear that term used a lot. Analogical predication is this notion that when we say things about God, when we describe God, we are describing things that are true about God. They're really true, but they are true by way of analogy. They're not true in the most precise sense. And so what we mean is, when we say that God is just, or we say that there's justice in this world, that we have experienced, some action of a human being or a society is just, we don't mean exactly the same thing, but what we do mean is something similar, right? So there's something similar to human justice that is a reflection of divine justice, but they're not exactly the same thing. Okay, so Thomas Aquinas is going to say that any human concept can't really grasp the nature of the divine essence. We're just using concepts that align in some way with the really unknowable nature of God, unknowable in his purity of his essence. And Scripture does this undoubtedly in some ways. Everybody admits that there are analogies to some degree, like when you use poetic language to refer to God. The Psalms talk about God having wings or arms or legs or these very human kind of things, which we recognize that there is a kind of truth that can be expressed through analogies. We do this with children especially all the time. So that's a way of understanding God by way of analogy. Now, there is this equivocal view, which would say essentially that, well, there's really nothing that's similar about a human concept of, say, justice and the divine concept of justice. And people have rejected this view because if you're going to say that, then really you've got no way to understand anything about God, and then what's the point of talking about him in the first place? And so there's the third perspective that is univocity. Now, univocity is a way to say that there is an alignment between the concepts we use and understand in our own life and experience and what is true about God. And so the univocal perspective would say that, yes, when I say that God is just, I really do mean the same thing as what I mean when I say that a human being or a society is just. It's just in an infinitely greater way. So in other words, the way that the divine attributes work is that they are different from things in this world that we experience, not distinct so much in absolute essence or whatness of what they are, but instead they are distinct by degree. Okay. So Scotus is going to have a kind of univocity that he's going to argue for here, But it is important to distinguish his approach to univocity from some later and other approaches to univocity, because it's not so simple as just to say that he believes that our language about God is univocal. Scotus' concern is that if God is only known by way of analogy, as Thomas says, he's going to say metaphysics is essentially impossible. We can't really, if our concepts are merely analogies of what is true about God, we can't really know or talk about metaphysics. We're just kind of playing word games here. He says there has to be something, there has to be some form of connection between created being and divine being, so that our language about God is real, it's comprehensible, it actually connects to the reality of God that we're talking about here. And so he says there has to be what he calls a common concept of being, specifically of being, between God and creatures, so that we align with one another in some way. Now, being, for Scotus, is an abstract concept. It can be defined or applied in numerous different ways. So he doesn't really have a clear singular definition of being. And so he wants to have this sense of univocity of being, but he also is going to say that to share in being can mean radically different things, because there are radically different kinds of being. So he wants to have this kind of connecting point in human being and divine being, but they're not always really identical with one another. They're seriously distinct. Now, the way that Scotus is going to tend to describe the divine nature and the divine being, in contrast to created being, is through a strong distinction between finitude and infinity. And so he's going to largely describe God by means of his infinity. God is absolute infinite perfection. Leibniz speaks similarly later, who's a Scotist in some ways, really. So he's going to say, though, that when a concept is added to being, we talk about goodness as added to being, then the concept is not really univocal at all. So there's still a strong distinction between what we mean when we refer to God and man. And so in reality, anything that is said of God still in Scotus' system is really still kind of analogous rather than univocal. Because though the concepts that we use to refer to God, something, say, like goodness, they're theoretically univocal, the concepts are in some way, the way in which they are actually instantiated in God, united to the divine being, are seriously distinct. They're not aligned. They're only known by way of analogy. And so there are a lot of different interpretations of Scotus on this point. And I'm not going to give you a definitive interpretation of Scotus here. But if you look at the literature on Scotus, there's a lot of debate about how much Scotus actually differs from St. Thomas on this point. And so there are arguments that say that he doesn't really believe in the univocity of being in the strongest sense, that this is more of a conceptual distinction than it is a real distinction, say, between Thomas's view and Scotus's view. So I'm not going to resolve this debate here, but at least what's important to know in terms of our intellectual history here is that, at the very least, Scotus starts to think in more univocal terms, or introduces univocity within the conversation in terms of how it is that we communicate about God. And people like William of Ockham and others later are going to be a lot clearer about what univocity exactly is. Okay, so univocity between God and creatures applies, as I said, conceptually. So there is a conceptual identification between an attribute like justice, between, say, God and man. However, this is not an exact metaphysical identification. So there is a real conceptual identification so that our minds grasp something real, in other words, when we understand, say, justice as we talk about God. But that doesn't mean that metaphysically, in their essence, in their being, justice in God and justice in man are precisely the same. They're not. So what Scotus is trying to do here is he's trying to avoid equivocation. He is worried that this analogous approach is going to make statements of God not real. It's going to essentially say that we can't actually know anything about God. And so he's going to say metaphysics is impossible. And so we need to have some way to really speak about God if we can say anything positively about him at all. So there is a bit of a difference here then in what's called apophatic and cataphatic theology. Apophatic theology is saying that we know God by way of negations, by saying what God is not. Everybody believes this to some degree, that when we attribute things to God, we are often saying that God is not this, right? So when you say God is omnipotent or all-powerful, we're saying that he doesn't have any limitations upon his power. Say, when we say that God is atemporal, he's outside of time, we are saying that he doesn't have the limits of time, right? He's not bound by it. So we're saying that God lacks limits, and we're often when we're talking about God. Which, of course, Scotus is going to like that because of the way he talks about infinity. But this more negative way of talking about what God is not than what God is, apophatic theology, is going to be a little more prominent in the Thomistic tradition than it is in the Scotist one. And so the Scotist one wants to have a more strongly cataphatic theology, one that has more positive affirmations about who God is and about the divine nature. Okay. Scotus also is going to reject another really essential distinction for St. Thomas Aquinas, and that is the distinction between essence and existence. And so Thomas is going to say that essence and existence can be distinguished from one another, so that a thing can have an essence but not actually exist in some way, and that gets into a whole other discussion here. But because we can talk about forms and conceptual forms and things like that, but this is particularly relevant to the question of God's existence and his essence. And so what Thomas is going to say is that God's essence, uniquely, as a non-contingent essence, is identical with his existence. In other words, his essence actually necessitates that he exists, unlike anything else in existence. Everything else is contingent. God is necessary existence. Scotus is going to reject this perspective and say that there is no distinction between essence and existence. Now, I mentioned that there are a lot of debates about Scotus, and sometimes it's probably true that at least in popular intellectual histories, or at least things you find on the internet, the division between Scotus and Thomas is probably overplayed. They're certainly distinct, but they're probably not as distinct as is often assumed or asserted that they are. Oftentimes, this really strong distinction between the two is going to rely on a narrative in which Scotus kind of has to be the villain of history. so you make him sound a lot more extreme, I think, than he was. And Scotus is not easy to read, to be clear. If you try to read Scotus, he's tough. He's a lot more difficult than St. Thomas. He doesn't have something like the Summa that's systematically laid out. So it's easier to differ on interpretations of Scotus than it is on Thomas. The ridiculous amount of Thomas interpretations notwithstanding. But it's probably not quite so radical, the distinction between the two of them, as one might assume. And in some ways, you might even say that Suarez, who becomes, in some ways, the most influential metaphysical thinker in the 17th century, it's among both Roman Catholics and Protestants, is in some ways kind of a synthesis between Scotus and Thomas Aquinas on certain points. Then let's talk about the idea of divine simplicity. Now, divine simplicity, if you're not familiar with this term, this is the idea that God is not composite. He is not composed of parts. And so divine simplicity says that all things in creation, contingent things, are composed of parts. So that's physical things, but it's not just physical things. That's other things as well that are non-physical. And everything is, at the very least, a composite of, well, essence and existence have to come together. But human beings, we're composites in a number of ways. We have different body parts that come together. We have different attributes of our personalities. We're composite. God is non-composite. He is ontologically simple. He is a being who cannot be divided. Now, Scotus and the nominalists too, they do affirm divine simplicity. At least many nominalists affirm divine simplicity. But this doctrine of divine simplicity is really essential for Thomas's system. It's a central element of Thomas's system. And for Scotus, he affirms it, and it's not that it's unimportant, but it doesn't have the same kind of centralized place within his broader metaphysical and theological system. And so Scotus is going to affirm divine simplicity, but then he is also going to make distinctions in the attributes of God in one sense. Okay, he's going to say that there are distinctions in the attributes of God, say distinctions between justice and the divine essence, or justice and goodness. And everybody is going to say, conceptually, okay, there's a distinction. So everyone who believes in divine simplicity is going to say that, no, justice and love aren't exactly the same. They're not all of God's properties are not identical to each other, but all of God's attributes are identical with the divine essence, but they are different ways to express or understand or conceive of the divine essence. So we can say that, yes, justice is not a separable attribute from the simple nature of God, but we don't have to then say justice is exactly identical with love, because what we're doing is we're talking about concepts that we understand, or words that we use or understand to express something about the ineffable God. So we would say that there's a conceptual distinction. So this is due to human cognition and our understanding. We understand these things separately, but we do also understand that the divine essence is simple and we can't comprehend that. So it's as if when God speaks about himself, he divides himself into parts, but that's a conceptual thing on our part, not real. So Scotus is going to say it's more than conceptual distinctions, but they aren't metaphysical distinctions. So it's not like there are separable attributes from the divine essence. So he's not going to say like justice could be removed from God and so could love, where God's essence aligns with some other external standard of love or justice, or God is a composite being of a bunch of attributes coming together. He's not going to say that. So what he's going to create then is this other category, which he's going to say that these attributes are distinct formally, but not really, and not just conceptually. So a formal distinction and a real distinction are differentiated from Scotus. And he uses this to talk about how it is that individuals' things relate to universals. So, for example, he's going to say that a human nature is a universal essence. We're talking about something general, a universal, humanity, human nature. He's going to say that human nature itself is distinct from the instantiation of that nature in a particular person. And so there's a difference between the essence as conceived universally and the essence as conceived within a particular instantiation of it. But he's going to say this is not a real distinction, it's a formal distinction. It's not a real distinction because it's not as if the individual person just has something like human nature, or the individual person has just like a little piece of human nature. No, that individual has a human nature. They partake in human nature, but we're speaking distinctly when we are talking about the universal versus the particular. So it's a distinction in some way, but not a metaphysical distinction. And so for Scotus, he's not a strong realist, though he is a form of a realist. So he's not going to say that there is a universal idea of a human essence that is then instantiated in individuals that can be distinguished from those individuals, like a Platonic realist would say, where there is this realm of the forms that exists prior to and apart from the individual particulars that partake of those forms, whether it's human nature or justice or whatever it might be. And so he's going to say things like goodness and wisdom are differentiated formally, right? They are formally distinct in some way. So there is a real distinction in some sense, but they are not really distinct. They're not metaphysically distinct. They're not distinct essences or something like that. Okay. So in his metaphysics, he's going to differ from Thomas and the broader Aristotelian tradition of this time in what is perceived as the individuating principle of things. So the question, in other words, of what is it that makes individual instantiations of a universal essence separate from each other? So what is it that makes human nature distinct in me and my wife and my kids? We all have the same universal thing that is humanity. What makes us distinct, though? Because we're clearly not just one undifferentiated blob, So the Thomistic tradition is largely going to say that the body is going to distinguish one instantiation from another, especially of humanity, right? So we're going to say that, well, as human nature is instantiated into a particular body, that is going to create distinction. That's going to distinguish one human being or one human person from another. Now, Scotus is going to reject this view. he's going to say it's not the body at all that makes this distinction. It's, in fact, something else. And we'll talk about what that is. Okay. So for Scotus, the Thomistic view allows for the intellect only really to grab the universal but not the particular. And so he sees a kind of abstraction of the intellect in this view, that because everything is centered on the universal first, Scotus is going to say that you don't really know particular things at all. You don't really know your real experience, what you encounter in regular life. That's almost kind of like a shadow or something, as Plato will literally say. But so in Scotus's argument, Thomas only understands individual things by way of similitude to a universal idea. So we only know individual things as they are similar, are analogous to, or partake in the universal idea. And for Scotus, then, this is going to create a very strong division between that which is known through the intellect, which is the realm of the universals, and that which is known through sense experience, touch, sight, hearing, all those kinds of things, which are the particulars. So it's interesting, we see this divide in Scotus here as he's working through something that is going to dominate philosophy for hundreds of years after him. And that is this latent tension between rationalism and empiricism, or this question of which has primacy in the way that we know about the world, our sense experience in which we encounter individual things, or our reason, which can abstract and find universal, logical, or rational principles about the world. Now, Scotus is not a nominalist, as I said, but he certainly moves in that direction. So he moves toward a much stronger focus on the particular rather than the universal thing. So we see this move toward a kind of nominalism, or in the direction of nominalism, without actually explicitly being nominalist. Okay, so then we have this concept. One of the things that Scotus is known for more than anything else is this concept called hexaeity, or this is the thisness of a thing. This is this kind of principle of individuation. It is this hexaeity, or this thisness, that distinguishes the particular from the universal. So it's the hexaeity that distinguishes between the universal principle, say, of justice and an act that is actually just. So individual things have both quiddity. So quiddity is what a thing is, and hexaeity, the thisness of a thing. And so we can say this about really everything that exists. So we can talk both about the what, or the essence of a thing, or the thatness in this particular instantiation. Now he's going to say that hexaeity, or individuality, does not have content in and of itself. So there's no unique or specific content within this hexaeity. So it doesn't bring anything new, in other words. This is why the distinction is not real, but formal. Because if you're going to say that hexaeity brings a new content that's distinguished from the universal thing, well, now you have a real distinction, not a formal distinction. But a formal distinction says, no, the difference is the instantiation itself, but there's no new content or being or something like that within the thisness of this instantiation. Okay. And I know this is getting abstract, I'm sorry. That's just how medieval philosophy is. Okay, in some sense, the multiplication of the individual, he's going to say, is greater than the universal. And so he's going to talk about this in terms of beatitude, eternal beatitude of God's creatures that we are created for. So there is a sense in which this multiplication of individuals to collectively partake of eternal beatitude, eternal joy and glory and delight in God, is going to be in some way greater than if there were, say, lesser instantiations of people partaking of this eternal beatitude. So there is a greatness of multiplication of things. Okay. Now, another element of Scotus's thought, and this is something that I think you don't want to go too far with this, because I'm saying this is a general principle. But theologians often center the way that they talk about God on some kind of core concept, we might say. Like there's one concept that tends to drive the way a theologian talks and speaks about God. And these all don't have to be in competition with each other. So I said you got to be careful with what you're doing with this, because it's not as if you got to choose between all of these things. But there are orientations that theologians have. So for Thomas, God is understood primarily as being, the essence of God. This notion of being becomes central to Thomas's perception of God as a whole. For Scotus, infinity is the primary concept of how we understand God. For Occam, we're going to see that will or divine freedom becomes really the core or central concept by which we understand God. I mentioned a later theologian, one of my favorites, Ernst Sartorius, in his book, The Doctrine of Divine Love. He uses love as this definitive, defining concept of who God is. Now, these theologians all, believe in divine simplicity, so they're not pitting these things against each other. But it is true that we perceive of God often differently in how it is that we kind of prioritize the terms or ideas that we use to speak about God. And so often we think of the other attributes in light of one particular central theme, say, within our system. One might even say something like justice, maybe in some Calvinistic systems. Scotus, even though he's critical of philosophy, right, and he's critical of he's a philosopher, but he's critical of what's possible through philosophy, and he's critical of human reason to some degree, he does believe that the existence of God is rationally provable, but he does it differently than Thomas does. Now, he says that arguments for God's existence are properly really the field of philosophy, not really the field of theology. And that all kind of makes sense. None of that should be surprising, as we've talked about this distinction between theology and philosophy within Scotus and then within nominalism as well. So he's going to say the existence of God, the arguments there are really more about philosophy because theology deals more directly just with the revelation. Now, Scotus is going to reject Anselm's ontological argument, which is an argument that he makes from the definition of God to God's existence. He actually rejects it, but then he kind of rehabilitates it in another way. But Scotus is going to reject this idea that the notion of God is a self-evident truth. And this is something that, at least after the Reformation, the Protestants are going to, by and large, reject, as they tend to have a much stronger view of what we call innate knowledge of God than many of the medievals tend to have. Scotus also rejects St. Thomas's famous 5 ways or 5 proofs of the existence of God. And this is because, in Scotus's view, contingent things can never lead to necessary or non-contingent knowledge. We can't, in other words, look at the contingent things in the world, dependent things, particular things, and reason toward universal principles or truths. Here you have kind of a precursor to what Kant is going to do much later. And here is a turn where I think Scotus really does start to shape the way that modern philosophers think about things. I think it's a wrong move, but it is one that is going to have a significant impact down the road here. We're saying that there is this divorce or divide between kind of the rational world of universal ideas and the contingent world of sense experience. And this divide between these two things is going to become greater and greater as philosophy develops in the West in the modern period. But we see really the roots of that distinction here. So he reject argumentation from causal chains toward an uncaused cause. Scotus argues then from necessity and possibility. And so what he tries to do is create an a priori proof of God's existence. In other words, a proof of God's existence that is not dependent upon any particular thing that happens in this world. And so he's going to deal with things of what is possible. And in a way, again, Scotus really is a precursor to this possible world semantics that takes over, especially in analytic philosophy in more recent years, but that's really popularized first by Leibniz. And so he makes these moves toward the theoretical, toward the possible, what is theoretically, rationally possible, rather than what is the case. Because, again, there's this divide between contingency and non-contingency, and the two things can't really come into connection with one another intellectually. You can't prove one from the other. Okay, so what then is Scotus's proof for the existence of God? Now, he begins, as I said, with possibility. So he says, if God decided not to create, because we're not dealing with contingent realities, it would still be a necessary truth of reason that created being could be made. We know that because it happens, so it's a possibility that it could be the case. And he says, the possibility of contingent being existing could not be just dependent upon a series of horizontal contingent causes. Horizontal meaning other created beings or created contingent things. Even if one posited some kind of infinite number, say, of contingent things, so you can't just have contingent things existing without resting upon anything else for their being, because that by the very nature, definition of contingency, they're reliant. So you can't just have a realm of contingency with no non-contingency that's that's upholding it metaphysically. So Scotus refers to these contingent things that depend on each other as the totality of things. This totality must have a cause outside of itself, as the totality is, by definition, caused. It has to be caused if it's contingent. A cause thing cannot ultimately be a causal explanation, as this just pushes the question back further, right? So if you just take a bunch of contingent things and say, this is a cause of this, is a cause of this, is a cause of this, you're just pushing the question back. You're not actually answering the question of how contingent being exists at all. Now, there must be some cause of the totality which stands outside of that totality. And so there must be a cause outside of the totality that gives being to the totality that the totality is dependent upon. And so this uncaused cause is infinite perfection, which he is going to then define as God. There's the short of his proof. And it's pretty complicated in the way that he expresses it. I'm trying to boil it down as simply as I possibly can, which is not the easiest thing in the world to do. So I'm trying here. Okay, then let's talk about voluntarism. And voluntarism is something I've discussed in another video that I recorded before this, but I don't know which of these is coming up first, as it shows up within a later Lutheran realm. And voluntarism, as I mentioned before, this is a characteristic of nominalism, and this is the centralizing of the divine will when we're talking about the nature of justice or morality. And so voluntarism is going to, at its root, deny that God has any obligation to creatures. In other words, God is never obligated to do anything for the creature's benefit if he does not desire to do so. God does not have principles of right reason or of, say, moral law which govern how he interacts or could interact with the world. And so the voluntarist perspective is going to say that which is good because God has willed it, rather than saying God wills that which is good because it is good. This is a really significant distinction here. Justice, he's going to say, is determined by the divine will. So God's will determines what is just. So justice is not about something that is inherent to God's nature. This is going to be a significant difference, not just from Thomas, but also from Anselm. If you read Anselm's book, Crudeus Homo, his entire treatise on the nature of the incarnation, of the why of the incarnation, is dependent upon a particular understanding of the necessity of divine justice and divine honor. So now Scotus is going to move away from really the whole scholastic tradition here by doing this and saying that God just determines that which is just. And Scotus can at times, when he's talking about moral law, especially the Ten Commandments, speak about some kind of necessity, at least in the first two commandments. So there is some kind of necessity in loving God that's not just dependent upon the divine will. But the rest of the Ten Commandments and the moral laws in Scripture are really just dependent upon the divine decree. So God could have willed otherwise. So moral truths are all contingent, not necessary truths. Such as the prohibition of murder or adultery. These are just contingent. God decreed that such would be the case, that these are wrong, and that a breach of these things would be an act of injustice. But Scotus is going to say that that doesn't mean that we have no understanding of the law apart from revelation. He's not going to say, therefore, that the pagan who doesn't have the Ten Commandments written in Scripture just has no moral compass. But so he's going to point to, yes, there's a moral law written on the heart. And so there is a consideration of the conscience that can lead to an understanding of law through nature, what we call natural law. However, he's not going to say that really the principles of reason can derive moral or natural laws at all. And that's going to be a really significant difference from someone later like Immanuel Kant, who's very similar to Scotus in some ways, but Kant is going to say that moral truths are part of this a priori. These are the non-contingent things that we can derive through reason or through a consideration of humanity and what is good for humanity, what is the common good, these kind of things. So all of that Scotus is going to say, no, we just have natural law or we have supernatural revelation, natural law as in the law written on the heart. So we basically just have the conscience and we have supernatural revelation. That's really it in terms of moral principles and where we derive those things from. This voluntaristic perspective is then applied to saving merit. And here is where we're going to see the argument that this is what Luther does and takes in his doctrine of justification. So I'm going to talk about this in a different video. But so Christ's saving merit, he's going to say, the merit which saves, which is counted as righteousness, is not inherently saving. In other words, it's not inherently so good that it has the property essentially of saving or redeeming. Instead, Christ's merit does merit for us simply because of the divine decree. God has decreed that it be so. So God has covenanted, he has decreed, decided that Christ's merit would merit something for us, that it would count before God. There's this concept of covenant that's very prominent within Scotus as well, and later Scotists. So that God makes these kind of covenants or these commitments that he is going to accept something as, say, justice or righteousness or as a sin. So the same thing works with sin as well. So he's going to say the same thing with sin, that God has decreed or decided that certain things would be sin or counted as sin. Now, there's an argument then that's going to be made from critics of the Reformation, largely, that this perception of Scotus stands behind Luther's view of justification. Now, this is more complicated than I can get into here, because this is not on that issue. I'm going to do a separate talk on that issue. But in this interpretation, it is said that faith alone justifies or makes righteous. This is Luther's perspective, that faith alone receives justification, meaning righteousness before God. So this perception would say that he's taking this from Scotus, and you can see where the argument comes from, that he believes that God has covenanted or decreed simply that faith will count as righteousness. Not because there is anything inherently righteous about either faith or the one who has faith or the Christ who is present in faith. Instead, it is simply a matter of decree. So God has simply decreed that it be so, that faith be just, and that unbelief be unjust. And there's no grounding ontologically underneath faith counting one as righteous. Again, I think that that is a wrong understanding of what Luther's doing, though there are certain distinctions in terms of the divine will that Luther does draw on to an extent here. But I think it is overly simplistic, and I think there are a lot of other things going on in the way that Luther develops his doctrine of justification. And I think that's very clear when you start to see that Luther's early doctrine of justification is not even very forensic at all. But that's a question for another video. Okay. Scotus is going to reject instrumental causality in the sacraments. In other words, the sacraments are the same in that they're really just delivering grace because God has decreed it to be so. They're not just instrumental causes, which is the traditional way of speaking about this, that they're an instrumental cause that God uses to bring himself and his, say, created gifts or grace. We're not going to use the language of created grace within a Lutheran tradition, but that's the way Rome does. And the sacraments are instruments to deliver that. And so he's simply going to say, no, the sacraments do what they do because God has decreed it to be so. So you're going to get this loss of a kind of metaphysical realism in this relationality between God and man pretty much altogether. He rejects eudaimonistic ethics. Now, a eudaimonistic ethic is an approach to ethics which says that there is a goal in ethical life. And the goal of the ethical life is happiness. Right? Happiness is the ultimate goal. And happiness is not defined within classical ethics in the way we define it today. They're talking about a lot more than just like feeling good. Happiness is a well-ordered life, a life that is meaningful, that is purposeful. So that this is a teleological ethic, which means that your life is lived for a purpose, and your ethics are part of a broader system of character and life that have a goal. That's rejected by Scotus. You can't really have eudaimonistic ethics if you have this voluntarist view of moral law. And so what you find in Scotus is really what becomes the foundation for what would later be described as a divine command theory. Divine command theory is an approach to law and ethics that simply says that what is morally right is right because God has said so. And that which is a moral breach is a moral breach because God has said so. Therefore, we need to align our lives with this moral law that God has declared because God has said so. Right? And so this can become a very legalistic, I think, approach to ethics. And I have a lot of issues with with a lack of eudaimonistic ethics. And I think character ethics is almost one of the most essential elements of life that we need to recapture in our age to have a sense of a meaningful life. Because if everything is defined purely as abstracted moral duties, there's not really any seeming purpose or joy in living the moral life. You feel like you're just confronted with the angry father all the time saying, you better do this because I said so. And I think there's more to God's moral purpose in this world than I said so. The thing that we all hated hearing from our parents as kids, why should I do that? Because I said so. Not that I haven't said this to my kids, but okay. So this is the foundation of what becomes divine command theory, as I said, that ethics don't really serve the end of happiness, but instead they're duties that are defined by the divine will. And this is going to appear after the Reformation through figures like Samuel Pufendorf, and most significantly and popularly through Immanuel Kant. So we are still very much living with the consequences of this idea. Maybe some of you like Kant's ethics and think these are good things. I personally don't. It's not all negative. I mean, the benefit of this, of course, is that at least you have something objective you're grabbing onto when you're speaking about morality. It's not a purely subjective ethic or anything like that. Okay. Then finally, I want to end here with just a quick mention of what happens after Scotus. Why does this figure matter? He's much earlier. He precedes modernity by a lot. So what's the influence of it? Why is he important for the story of modernity? Well, his ideas predominate among the Franciscans, especially in the following centuries. And so there are Scotists, and they call themselves Scotists for many years. They're still Scotists today. And so he starts a school of thought. And Scotism and Thomism are competing schools of thought for a very long period of time within the Roman Church. And for a few hundred years after the Reformation, that battle between those views continued. And then you have Suarez, who also is another influential figure who's followed largely by the Jesuits. And so you don't just have those two options either. But the point is, Scotus has a really strong following. He's very influential, well beyond his day. And his system is intellectually rigorous. I mean, guy's a brilliant thinker. He has clear categories. Unfortunately, he didn't live long enough to write a more systematic text. I wish he had. But there are plenty of people that do that for him. There are a lot of Scotist manuals that are systematic treatments of both theology and moral philosophy from a Scotistic perspective that cite him on various issues, trying to systematize him. He has a huge influence on William of Ockham, next major figure we'll look at in history, and then Gabriel Biel. Those two thinkers, so if you really want to understand that late medieval period, and who's so important within scholasticism after the time of Thomas Aquinas, those three figures are the most essential. Buridan is really important too. There are others, so it's not like these are the only important ones, or Gregory of Rimini, but these are, if you're going to know any of the names, you got to know just a few. Those are the ones that you want. If you do want a treatment of this, if you ever want to look into a book that delves into all of this stuff, there is a classic work, and it's older now, but it's still extremely useful, though I don't agree with the way that he deals with Luther's relation to these things, but that's another question. And that is Heiko Obermann's A Harvest of Medieval Theology. It's a pretty dense read, but if you have interest in this era, Obermann is the one who really revitalized interest in this era altogether, which had largely been neglected before that. So those figures are very influenced by Scotus. Then voluntarism has adherents in various theological camps. So Scotus's ideas are influential just across the board. Now, where he has the strongest influence is definitely among the Franciscans. But voluntarism does get a foothold, particularly through Samuel von Pufendorf within Lutheran Orthodoxy in Germany, though his view is not a very popular one among the Lutheran Orthodox, who tend to adopt either a more Thomistic approach or a more Suarezian approach. The earlier Lutheran Orthodox are more Thomistic, the later ones follow Suarez more. Among the Reformed, I'm not as familiar here, but at least from what I've been told by those who seem to know things in this area, there is something of a connection between some of the Reformed Orthodox and voluntarism, divine command theory, and the Reformed notion of covenant as it's expressed in certain figures. Not an expert there, so This is just what I've been told. So don't come at me for that one. I could be totally wrong. I don't know. I'm trusting other people. Okay, but among the Franciscans, who are the most influential or most explicit in their Scotism, we have Bartolomeo Mastri, 1602 to 1673, Bonaventura Belluto, 1600 to 1676, Claude Frasson, 1620 to 1711, Luke Wadding, 1588 to 1657, and then finally Juan Carmel y Lobkowitz, 1606 to 1682, though he's also a Thomist in some areas as well. So you do have figures that are a bit eclectic, drawing from various schools. And Lobkowitz is a proponent of a view called probabilism. Probabilism was at one time in the 17th century a growing movement among some Roman Catholic scholastic theologians toward a view of the moral law, which was essentially voluntarist, which would argue from principles of probability, that these things are probably right or probably wrong, and therefore we should act on them. And these thinkers, I think, are rightly criticized. If you ever read some of the probabilists, the kinds of moral actions that they justify are pretty darn bizarre. And so you have some moral casuistry works in that era that follow that line of thought. So what you see there is that Scotus and his views on these issues have a really big impact on the Roman Church. It's not just that they have a big impact on the Reformation, and it's a wrong read to say that this just impacts the Reformation. Scotus has a much more explicit following, at least within Rome, than he does among those in the Protestant Reformation. But hopefully this talk has at least maybe given you a little bit more context for Scotus. He's a figure who's really confusing. He's difficult to read, and his influence is debated. People debate a lot about what Scotus believed about all sorts of things. So he's not an easy figure to really get a hang of in a lot of ways. So make sure you subscribe and like this video, subscribe on YouTube, subscribe on your podcast app if you just want to listen to these talks. I've got a number of other talks in this area that I really want to do. As I said, there's one on Pufendorf I just did. I don't know which of these is coming out first. And I would like to do one on Occam and Beale as well. And then I really want to do one just covering the issue of the Reformation and say, like, what was going on in the Reformation? What was the relation between nominalism and Martin Luther and Philip Melanchthon and maybe John Calvin, if I want to go there, because I think it's a lot more complicated than simplistic treatments often make these things out to be. So thanks so much, and we'll see you in the next one. God bless.